say I'm the man who needs no introduction. I always said that about myself, so I guess now it's true. And I'm not sure whose notes that are now all over the floor, but here they are. So good morning. In February of last year, I attended the annual convention for the Centers for Spiritual Living in Southern California. And it was at this convention that I was elected as a member of the CSL Member Council. And while I was there, I ran into Lane Morgan, who many of you know is a former practitioner and staff minister here at SLCA. And Lane told me that she had watched the video of the first talk that I'd given here at SLCA in the old building in December of 2017. And she extended an invitation for me to deliver some version of that talk at her center that she now has north of Tampa, Florida. And I told her that I could definitely see myself taking my speaking talents on the road to other spiritual centers in the future. And at the time, I had visions of Joel Osteen in my head, you know, standing in front of or in front of an audience of tens of thousands of people in an arena. And you know, I thought maybe that's how Billy Graham got his start. And speaking of Billy Graham, I read a story about him, and it's told that early in his ministry, he arrived in a small town to deliver a sermon, and he needed to mail a letter. So he asked a young boy that he saw on the street where the post office was. And after the boy gave him directions, Dr. Graham thanked him and said, if you come to the Baptist church this evening, you can hear me telling everyone how to get to heaven. And the little boy replied, I don't think I'll be there. You don't even know your way to the post office. Well, much like the young boy brought Billy Graham back to earth with his remark, Lane brought me back to earth when she confided in me that many spiritual directors in our movement will not open their pulpit to speakers or to guest speakers who are not ordained ministers. And while that revelation was eye-opening for me, it also made me ask myself the title of my first talk, which was, what are you doing here? But regardless of what I'm doing here, here I am for the third time. And unlike when I gave my talk, the last talk back in July of last year, this time I had the opportunity to pick the topic for myself. And some of you who've seen the title of the talk may be wondering, okay, what does it mean? It pays to know your spiritual VP. Could that stand for it pays to know your spiritual vice president? Nope, sorry, no Mike Pence or Joe Biden here. Did I hear a thank you? How about it pays to know your spiritual vice principal? Once again, the answer is no, and I don't know any famous vice principals that I could state their name that you would be familiar with. And how about it pays to know your spiritual voice protocol? And for those of you who are here this morning who are techies, you probably appreciate that, but once again, the answer is no. Now, by a show of hands, who do we have here this morning that has a job or perhaps a side hustle where you provide personal or professional services to clients or customers? Perhaps a personal trainer, a financial advisor, or perhaps a life coach. Okay, so quite a few of you. And those of you who raise your hand know that when you try to convince a client or a prospective customer to hire you, you typically do so by creating an expectation that they'll receive something of value in exchange for the money that they're paying for those services. So for example, if I was considering hiring Idella as a personal trainer, she might say, Lee, I can help you achieve your physical fitness goals by developing a workout regimen for you, by coaching you through the individual exercises, and by leading you through individual workout sessions. So in that case, the value I would be receiving would be support and assistance in achieving my financial goals, or my fitness goals rather. And a financial advisor like Mark, if I was considering hiring him, he might say, well, Lee, I can help you achieve your financial objectives by preparing a financial plan that takes into account your life goals and your risk tolerance. So in that case, the value I would be receiving is help in achieving my financial goals. Or in the case of someone who provides handyman services, let's say someone like a plumber, it might be more simple, just a matter of providing a solution to my plumbing problems, whether that be fixing a leaky faucet or installing a new fixture. And in each of these hypothetical scenarios, another term for the statement of value that you provide to your customers or clients is your value proposition. And a value proposition basically states the benefits of your products or services, and it tells people why they should do business with you. And some companies actually come up with a catchy phrase to capture their value proposition. And some examples, including a couple you may be familiar with, expect more and pay less, Target. Or here to help life go right, that's State Farm. Legal Shield has a value proposition that says worry less, live more. And someone like me could appreciate the value statement from a backpack manufacturer, Tortuga, that says bring everything you need without checking a bag. So you may be wondering, okay, where am I going with this? Well, actually, where I'm going is back to the title of my talk. It pays to know your spiritual VP stands for it pays to know your spiritual value proposition. And over the next few minutes, I'd like to explore what it means for each of us to have a spiritual value proposition and why it pays to know what that is. Now, when I say value proposition, that's not to be confused with values, which are basically just fundamental beliefs that guide the way an individual or company behaves. And some examples of these are things like honesty, integrity, and compassion. And most of you are probably familiar with the 6 value-based intentions that SLC established several years ago, including things like love, prosperity, and gratitude. So your value proposition is not a statement of the things that you value spiritually, such as peace, love, and nonviolence. Rather, it's an expression or statement of the benefit or worth that you provide from a spiritual perspective. And obviously, if I make reference to your spiritual value proposition, then I'm implying that there is a distinction between that and things like your intellectual value proposition or your financial value proposition. But we'll explore those distinctions a little bit later. And I'm going to examine the concept of our spiritual VP or our spiritual value proposition from 3 dimensions. 1, the value that we provide to our global community, the value we provide to our local community, and the value that we provide to ourselves. And when I started preparing this talk, I thought back to a conversation I had with a gentleman that I worked with early in my time in the Air Force. I worked with a group of engineers, most of whom were civil service employees. And one of these engineers I remember distinctly was a guy who at the time I thought, okay, if he's not as old as Jesus, he's got to be pretty close. But in retrospect, he was probably like in his late 50s. And one of the things I remember about him was that he seemed to know everything about everything. So if I ever had a question about anything or something that I couldn't answer, I could always count on him to shed some light on the issue. And one day I was having a conversation with him in his office, and he said to me, he said, Lieutenant Valentine, you have to realize that no man is totally useless. At the very least, he can serve as a bad example. Well, from the standpoint of our spiritual value proposition, I think each of us can do much more than serve as a bad example. And I'm sure most of you have heard the term think globally, act locally in reference to protecting the environment. So for example, or an example of that would be think globally about mankind's need to reduce carbon emissions in the atmosphere, but act locally by recycling your plastic water bottles, or even better, drink from a reusable water bottle. And each of us can actually apply that same principle to our spiritual lives. And 2 months ago, there was a report from Indonesia that a 31-foot sperm whale had died and washed ashore on an island there. And when researchers inspected the remains of the whale, they found that its stomach contained over 13 pounds of human trash. And this included 115 plastic cups, 25 plastic bags, 4 plastic bottles, 2 flip-flops, and a sack containing over 1,000 pieces of string. And because of the animal's advanced state of decay, they were not certain whether it was the plastic that was the cause of death of the animal. They were confident that it was a contributing factor. And evidently when marine animals see plastic in the water, they eat it because they mistake it for food. And they cannot digest it and they cannot pass it. So what happens is over time, they begin to feel full, they eat less, and they often die of malnutrition. Now, if someone had approached each one of the people that threw away each of those pieces of garbage and said, if you don't recycle this bag or this cup or this bottle, it's going to end up in a whale's stomach and that whale is going to die, they probably would have gone out of their way to find a more responsible method of disposing of that piece of garbage. But when you think about it, you realize that each one of those individuals did have an opportunity to make a decision that would have led to a different outcome for that one piece of trash or that one piece of garbage. And if the disposer of each of those individual pieces of trash had made that different decision collectively, then the whale would probably still be alive today. So we seldom think about the broader implications of some of the actions we take on a daily basis, but this is truly an example where a set of local actions taken collectively ultimately had an unintended impact that was far outside the scope of what any of those individuals thought it could be. In his book, Conversations with God, Neil Donald Walsh addresses this very concept. In the book, one of the questions the author asks of God is basically, why do bad things happen in the world? Bad things like war, famine, natural disasters, disease, political and social unrest. And I could have spent my whole talk on this one topic, including describing how at the end of the day there really is no such thing as bad things and good things. But in the book, God's response is essentially that these events that we call bad are not of our choosing in a conscious sense, but they are of our creation. In a quote from the book, God says to Neil, "You're always in the process of creating, every moment, every minute, every day. Events, occurrences, happenings, conditions, circumstances, all are created out of consciousness. Individual consciousness is powerful enough. You can imagine what kind of creative energy is unleashed whenever two or more are gathered in my name. And mass consciousness, why that is so powerful it can create events and circumstances of worldwide import and planetary consequences." So put another way, think locally because your thoughts have a global impact. And that's really just another way to describe the law of attraction, which is one of the fundamental tenets of our teaching. And although we state this principle, and we stated this principle this morning as part of our call and response, when we say that all thought is creative and how I choose to think creates my personal experience. Or in the case of the individuals who discarded those 13 pounds of trash that ended up in that whale's stomach, what they chose to collectively think and act created an unfortunate experience for that whale. And another example of the think globally, act locally value proposition is world hunger. The current population of the world is about 7.7 billion people. And according to a recent study, the world produces 17% more food per person today than we did 10 years ago. And that translates to enough food to feed over 10 billion people. So why is it that 1 billion of us go hungry every day? Well, it's obviously not a matter of supply and demand, because according to those statistics, there's more than enough supply to meet the global demand of food. It's basically a matter of economics, because the people who go hungry each day either don't have enough land to grow their own food, or they don't have enough money to buy it. Now, I'm not going to go down a rabbit hole and try to make some case for socialism or redistribution of wealth, or in this case, redistribution of food. But what I will say is this: if you want to know why people are starving in the world, don't ask a priest, don't ask a minister, ask an economist or a political science professor, because they are much more likely to have the accurate answer. So if we think about the change we want to see in the world, our value proposition could simply be think locally, act globally. Think globally, act locally. Or, as Gandhi put it, so simply yet so eloquently, be the change we want to see. Now, to me, the distinction between our global community and our local community is not just one of geography or distance. For example, with advances in modern technology, we can in many ways be closer to someone who's halfway around the world than we are to our next door neighbor. Although some of us may question whether this is really an advancement or not, but that's a story for another day. And in the context of this morning's topic regarding our spiritual value proposition, I think the difference between our global community and our local community is one of connection. For example, we don't have much of a physical connection to a member of the migrant caravan that's traveling northward through Central America, but each of us has an intrinsic connection to the other members of SLCA, even if we don't know them by name. Likewise, we have a connection to the people we work with, even if we only see them when we pass each other in the hallway at work. And we obviously have an inherent connection with our friends and family members. And this brings to mind a quote from Harry Truman that I'm sure you've all heard, and I'll paraphrase it and say, when your neighbor loses his job, it's a recession. When you lose yours, it's a depression. In other words, when times are hard, how closely you're connected to those hard times will dictate how you characterize them. So what are the implications of our spiritual value proposition for our local community? I think it comes down to one word, and that one word is accountability. Now, when I was describing a value proposition for our global community or the world, I ended with a story about world hunger. And I think this is a great example of describing our value proposition for our local community as well. Now, for example, we don't have much of a physical connection to a child who is starving in sub-Saharan Africa, but we have a much closer connection to a child who's starving right here in Atlanta. For example, we might see a commercial on television soliciting donations for Feed the Children, and most of us would probably be more likely to change the channel than to actually send in a donation. But what about when you walk down the street in downtown Atlanta and you see a young mother asking for assistance in feeding her young children? Most of us would probably be more likely to offer some kind of assistance to that young mother than to someone on the other side of the world in the same predicament, simply because we feel a stronger connection or a stronger sense of accountability to someone who lives in our own city, in our own town, not too far from our home. Or if you're like our own Joe Labriola, is Joe here this morning? I saw Jan. You can demonstrate your spiritual value proposition by lending your time and talents to an organization like Second Helpings Atlanta, a nonprofit whose vision is to fight hunger in the metro area by rescuing surplus food and delivering it to those in need. And if you look at their website, there's actually a statement of the value proposition, which is simply driving out hunger 1 mile at a time. And another example of me personally demonstrating my value proposition for my local community, I can use one of my dear friends who's here in the audience today, John Harris, another one of my brothers from another mother. A number of years ago, I attended the Mayor's Mask Ball, which is a formal event they have every year, somewhere between Christmas and New Year's. It's held at the Marriott Marquis downtown, and it's a fundraiser for the United Negro College Fund. And they, in conjunction with the ball, they have a silent auction. And one of the years when I attended, one of the items they had at the silent auction was an autographed album by Bob Dylan. And my friend John, I knew was a huge Bob Dylan fan. He always teases me because he said I have a very narrow range of musical interests, but his are much wider. And when I saw that, I thought to myself, I said, John would really like this. And it wasn't cheap, but I made the investment. I put in a bid, bought it, and I surprised him with it. I presented it to him. He had no idea that I was going to be buying it, had no idea what it was, and it literally brought him to tears. And when he asked me, he said, Lee, why would you do that? Expecting nothing in exchange for that. And I said, I knew it would make you happy, and I knew this world could use another happy person. So thus far, we've examined how we can define our spiritual value proposition for the world, our spiritual value proposition for our local community, and the last dimension we'll look at is our spiritual value proposition for ourselves. And you might be thinking to yourself, okay, that doesn't make sense. How can we add spiritual value to ourselves? And well, you can think of it as part of your self-care routine. For example, if you're caring for an aging parent, you know that it's critical that you take care of your own physical health and well-being, because if you get sick, then there's no way for you to lend assistance to your parent while you recuperate. Likewise, if you're in a relationship where your significant other is going through some challenges that are taking a toll on them emotionally, it's important that you feed your own emotional energy, replenish your own emotional energy. Otherwise, you won't be of much use to them. And so what about spiritual self-care? Well, it's the same principle, only looking at it from a spiritual perspective. And it reminds me of a story I found online as I was researching this topic. One day a little boy was overheard praying, Lord, if you can make me a better boy, or if you can't make me a better boy, don't worry about it. I'm having a real good time like I am. And another way to think of this is you can't pour from an empty cup. You must nourish to flourish. Oftentimes we can get so focused on things that we think we need to do for other people or things that we want to do for other people that we lose sight of the things that we need to do or we want to do for ourselves. And I'm here to tell you this morning that self-care is not selfish. Actually, it's quite the contrary. So what are some of the ways that we can and should practice that spiritual self-care? Well, Vera Carter shared some of these last week, and I'm sure they'll resonate with you. Things like journaling, affirmative prayer or spiritual mind treatment, meditation, yoga, practicing forgiveness, or simply making a conscious effort to be present and mindful in each moment. But I think it boils down to this. We can add spiritual value for ourselves by consciously focusing our thoughts, our words, and our actions on things that bring us joy. And our founder, Dr. Ernest Holmes, said it this way. He said, people are born to be happy, to live creatively, to love, to sing, to dance, and to express themselves to the full. And for most of us, we adhere to these principles for the first 5 or 10 years of our lives. And then what happens? We start listening to the things that we hear from our friends, from our family members, from strangers on the street, from media, and nowadays, particularly from social media. And if we hear it long enough, we start believing it. We start believing things like no one who looks like me can be governor of the state of Georgia. We start believing that it's a sign of weakness for boys to cry. We start believing that no one in my family will ever graduate from college. Or we start believing that if you're not a size 2, then people won't find you attractive. And I could go on and on. Now, the late Debbie Ford, author of The Dark Side of the Light Chasers, put it this way. She said, the wounded ego must hide all that we believe is unacceptable about ourselves. To accomplish this task, it creates a mask to prove to others that we are not as defective, inferior, worthless, and bad as we might fear we are. None of us likes to admit that we have these flaws and insecurities, so to hide them, we create a persona at a very young age. We start to wrap ourselves up in a new package that we believe will bring us the love, attention, and acceptance that we hunger for. We create personas so that we can belong. So the question is, what do we do about this? And the answer is so simple that when I reveal it to you, you'll probably be skeptical. And I'll use a personal example to illustrate this. Whenever someone is elected to a position or to a council at Centers for Spiritual Living, CSL Home Office in Colorado has that person take a personality assessment to provide insight into their preferences and hopefully help the council or the team on which they will be serving to be more effective. And the one that CSL uses is called Emergenetics, but there are other assessments that some of you are probably familiar with, such as the Myers-Briggs personality type indicator and the DISC profile. And after you answer about 100 questions, you receive a detailed report that shows how you compare to the general population across 2 dimensions, how you think and how you behave. And there are 4 thinking attributes and 3 behavioral attributes. So let's pretend that this stage is the scale on which my results were presented. The middle of the stage would be the 50th percentile. So that means if I'm here, if I scored at the 50th percentile, that means half the people in the general population express that specific attribute to a higher degree than I do. Half the people in the general population express that attribute to a lesser degree than me. And so one of the attributes on the thinking dimension is called the structural attribute. So someone who scores high on that attribute has an expressed interest in process and following rules. It measures the degree to which you are a practical thinker, like guidelines, are cautious of new ideas, and are predictable. So this is the 50th percentile, 100% over there, 0% over there. Which way do you think I was? Okay. 55, 60. I heard somebody say keep going. A little more? Here? How about right here? I was in the 95th percentile on strategic thinking, or on structural thinking. That means that of the general population, I exhibit that preference more than 95% of the people. So one of the other attributes was the social attribute. And someone who scored high on that attribute has an expressed interest in people and relationships. It measures the degree to which you are relational, intuitive about people, socially aware, and show an ability to understand and share the feelings of another. Okay, 50% here. Which way should I go? Is this far enough? How about... I was in the 5 percentile on the social attribute. So what does that mean? Does that mean I'm a terrible person? Wait, don't answer that. And don't ask my ex-wife. She might have a different answer for that. What it means is that now that I'm equipped with this information about how I think and how I behave, I have a much more insight into my personal value proposition, not just in my interaction with others, but in my interaction with myself. And with that information, while I acknowledge that I am perfect, whole, and complete, I am also more aware of what's driving my thoughts, my feelings, and my actions. And I have an awareness of what I may need to do to compensate for my tendencies in certain situations, and what I may need to do to take advantage of those tendencies in other situations. So over the past few minutes, we've examined our spiritual value proposition for the world, for our local community, and for ourselves. And before I go any further, I have to tell you something. And the reason I'm going to tell you is if I don't, someone will point it out in the Q&A after this. Even though I've drawn a distinction between our global community, our local community, and ourselves, all of us here who are familiar with New Thought teaching, which is probably everyone in the room, knows that this is a misnomer. There's no me, us, and them. We're all one. There's one source, one mind, one first cause to all things. This is the thing itself that Dr. Ernest Holmes refers to in Chapter 1 of Science of Mind. In that chapter, he says, there's one life back of everything that lives. There's one energy back of all that is energized. This energy is everything. There's one spirit back of all expression. That is the meaning of that mystical saying taken from Book of Acts, chapter 17, verse 28. In him we live and move and have our being. And I'm sure you've all heard the quote from Rumi, the 13th century Persian poet, who said that we are not a drop in the ocean, we are the entire ocean in a drop. Well, that same principle applies to each of us. We are not one human manifestation of the collective consciousness of the universe. We are the collective consciousness of the universe in one human manifestation. So when I used the examples earlier in my talk about thinking globally and acting locally, what this means is we're all the same. Global, local, individual. We're all one. So the spiritual value that we provide to ourselves is the same spiritual value that we provide to our friends, our neighbors, our family members, our coworkers, and it's the same spiritual value we provide to everyone in the world. Energetically, vibrationally, it is all from, through, and as one. And also during my introduction, I said there is a distinction between our spiritual value proposition and things like our physical or our intellectual value propositions. Well, I have another confession to make, and some of you were probably thinking about this during my talk, and that is, at the end of the day, it's all spiritual. As we've heard many times before, we are not human beings having a spiritual experience. We are spiritual beings having a human experience. So our spiritual value proposition is our value proposition, period. If you're thinking about the value that you add to yourself, your local community, or the world, don't think about what I'm adding from a spiritual perspective, because it's all spiritual. Now, in 2010, I spent that year living and working in Southern California. And while I was there, I had the opportunity to visit Agape International Spiritual Center several times. And Agape is famous for its founder, Dr. Michael Beckwith. And on one of my visits, I went to their bookstore, which is probably about the same size as our sanctuary, and I bought a tapestry scroll with a quote by Edith Wharton. And Edith Wharton was a novelist who was the first woman to win the Pulitzer Prize for Literature in 1921. And the quote on the tapestry reads, "There are two ways of spreading light, to be the candle or the mirror that reflects it." And I would venture to say that none of us are always the candle or the mirror. In other words, if the stage were, the one end of the stage was the mirror, the other end of the stage was the candle, sometimes we're on this side, sometimes we're on that side. And when the situation dictates it, we're the candle, shedding light in a metaphorical sense by making any situation we encounter better, whether it's simply by offering a smile to a stranger that we pass on the street, or comforting a friend in a time of need. In other situations, we are the mirror, reflecting the light from someone else, acting as a conduit for their good thoughts, words, and deeds. And this is one reason why it's important that we always surround ourselves with positive people and things, because as we heard this morning, based on the law of attraction, we will reflect whatever it is they give out. And I'm sure some of you have seen a sign inside the door of someone's house that says, "All of our guests bless our home." Some by coming, others by leaving. So if you visit someone and they say to you on your way out, "Bless your heart," you may need to remember that it pays to know your spiritual value proposition. Thank you.